Good morning and welcome to the sixth meeting of 2014 of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public, please turn off your mobile phones. They affect the sound system. No flight modes or silent or whatever. We move on to agenda item 1, Scottish Government's implementation of the Common Agriculture Policy and Scotland's Rural Development Programme 2014 to 2020. And the committee will take its first evidence session on this from stakeholders on CAP and SRDP, to be followed next week with another stakeholder roundtable, then a session with Owen Patterson, and then the Cabinet Secretary the week after that. But first of all, I'd like to welcome our witnesses this morning. Good morning. I think it's all gentlemen so far. And I would like us to go round the table. I should say we've got an apology from Cara Hilton, who will be late due to personal family issues, and we'll welcome her when she arrives. But if you could just say who you are, please, it would help, starting with Johnny.
Morning, I'm Johnny Hall. I'm Director of Policy with NFU Scotland.
Hello, I'm Patrick Krauser. I'm with the Scottish Crofting Federation.
Good morning, I'm Sandy Simpson. I'm a board member of the Scottish Tenant Farmers Association.
Good morning, I'm Roger McCall. I'm here to represent the New Anthems Group, and I'm a full-time beef farmer.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Claudia Beamish, MSP for South Scotland and Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change.
Good morning, my name is Stuart Ashworth and I'm head of the economics team at Quality Meat Scotland.
Morning all, I'm James Withers, I'm Chief Executive at Scotland Food and Drink.
Good morning, Richard Lyle, MSP Central Region.
Morning, Ron Wilson, University of Edinburgh.
I'm Nigel Don, I'm the MSP for Angus North and Mearns.
Hi, good morning, Andrew Ski. I'm representing the British Potato Trade Association, and I'm also a seed potato grower and marketing person.
Alex Ferguson, MSP for Galloway and West Dumfries, and if I could just draw attention to my register of interests, convener, that register shows that I own land in Ayrshire, which I do not farm myself. I do not personally benefit from CAP support, but I've also recently agreed to chair the UK review of the Voluntary Code of Conduct in the dairy sector. I hope that will allow me to speak later in the meeting as well.
Good morning. William Houston, General Manager of Angus Growers, a soft fruit producer organisation from Angus.
Jim Hume, MSP for South Scotland, and also draw attention to my register of interests, where I have an interest in a hill farm down in the Borders, which my sons fully run, and etc. So.
Good morning, I'm Angus MacDonald, MSP for Falkirk East.
Good morning, Debs Roberts. Apologies for my late arrival. I am representing Scottish Organic Producers Association, also an organic farmer near Perth.
Morning, I'm Graham Day. I'm the MSP for Angus South.
Hello, and I'm Rob Gibson, the MSP for Caithness, Sutherland and Ross. I'm a member of the Scottish Crofting Federation, but I'm not a crofter. We're going to kick off, I think, by looking at things today in about 3 parts. We're going to look at the CAP, look at SRDP, and look at the implications more widely as we go along. And we're interested in each of you thinking about how the Scottish Government should deliver the Pillar 1 direct support for CAP funding in Scotland, and what you're looking for from the Scottish Government in terms of its priorities. And we've got a number of areas here that I think we're quite interested in looking at in this first question. Since we're moving from historic to an area base, I think that's got to be the first area. Does anyone want to make any comments about that move and its implications to kick things off? Johnny Hall.
Thank you. Yes, Chairman, Convener, you've rightly identified the challenges that Scotland faces as we move from a historic to an area-based system. Those challenges are, in a sense, magnified by the sort of landscape that Scotland has to farm. Scotland is a very diverse agricultural landscape indeed. and then fitting an area-based system to that presents its own set of challenges. That's compounded further by the fact that Scotland has a very limited Pillar 1 budget to play with, and also the fact that our predominant region, as we regionalise payments across Scotland, will be made up of the so-called rough grazing region, which in itself is significant, about 2.8 million hectares currently used to claim single farm payment entitlements. But within that rough grazing region, you also have huge variation. So you have hills that are very productive, hills which are much more extensive and less productive, but nevertheless active. So the challenge of fitting what will always be a relatively blunt area-based payment to such a diverse agricultural landscape is huge. And therefore, the approach that we've always taken is that we have to use the tools that are available through the political agreement of Pillar 1 to most effect to target those limited funds to where they are most required. And targeting means, by and large, how you regionalise, how you use coupled support, and any other measures that you might have available to you.
So basically you're saying that we've got to try and have a package, a palette of items that deal with the problems about having 2 or at most 3 areas that this is split up into.
Absolutely. The sort of worst case scenario for Scotland would be a blunt flat rate system which would severely hinder productive agriculture and arguably would overcompensate the very extensive rough grazing areas. Now, those areas still require support, but getting that balance right of directing the support where it's most needed to the places where the people, the farm businesses are bearing the risk, bearing the costs and delivering the goods is essential. So therefore, as you move to an area-based system, you have to use what tools you have available to you to provide, as you say, a package of support which makes most efficient use of our limited resources.
Okay, Alec Ferguson wants to come in.
To follow up on that point, if I may, Convener, and I wonder if Mr Hall or anybody else who wants to answer it can say how that targeting can be achieved when there is such an enormous variation of the type of land within the rough grazing area that we're talking about. And you mentioned 2.8 million acres that currently receive single farm payment. How many hectares are there that might come into the equation that currently don't receive such payment?
That's a very important point, and it's certainly something that the Scottish Government is very well aware of now, and certainly we've been pursuing the Commission on in Europe for some months, if not longer. Yes, currently under the current single farm payment system, there are 2.8 million hectares of rough grazing. And as I say, if we applied a flat rate across that of, by the Scottish Government's own calculations, of about €24 per hectare, that would decimate the more productive land in the Galloway Hills, for example, and the borders, and Perthshire, and up the Angus Glens, and various other places that currently can carry a ewe or ewe and a half per hectare, and they're producing a meaningful product, suckler calves as well. At the same time, €24 per hectare on some stretches of land, even if they have sheep at all, would be overcompensating those particular areas. Now, within that 2.8 million hectares, there's also the existing naked acres that we already have. Under the new scheme from 2015, as long as that land is eligible without a proper and robust activity test, and I know that the Scottish Government are very aware of this, then there is a danger you suck a further up to another million hectares into that equation. So we could go up to 3.8 million hectares, which, given our very limited budget, would dilute the payments for the active producer. We would miss the target. And there's absolutely no way that I think the Scottish Government or ourselves can stand back and watch payment being bled onto empty hillsides, which is doing nothing.
So how can you achieve what you're looking for with 2 regions?
With 2 regions where you have to be the absolute first step is activity, as I say, and we have within the political agreement the so-called Scottish Clause, which I'm sure you're all aware of. For the anoraks in the room, that's Article 4(1)(c) Indent 3. And basically, we thought that was going to be the silver bullet to sort out whether you're active or inactive, and we could use stocking densities on that basis. But the Commission have said no to an absolute stocking density because of WTO compliance issues, production-related support. But in the last wee while, with Richard Lockhead visiting the Commission again last week, and ourselves making representation, there seems to be scope for allowing Scotland to put in place on this rough grazing land, which is known as land that would be otherwise suitable for grazing if left to its own devices, then you can put in place a means by which the stock has to be carried on that land at an appropriate level, and you'd have to devise criteria about what that appropriate level would be. But it would certainly strip out no farming, or what we might call token farming, simply to activate a payment. We think that's an absolutely vital step in the first place. Thereafter, you've got possibly two further choices as to how you differentiate payments within that rough grazing region. The first one, and the front runner right now, would seem to be utilising additional coupled support over and above the 8% that we have earmarked for the beef sector, using additional coupled support using the UK ceiling but still using Scotland's budget to target hill sheep in particular. Now, how you target hill sheep is a very complicated business, and we can't possibly get into the detail of all that now, I'm sure. But nevertheless, you would target the money, the rough grazing region budget, at where the livestock actually are if you could use more coupled support. And that would then allow you to lower the base area payment where the sheep are fewer in number, indeed, if not at all. But of course, the not at all should be cleared out anyway by a robust activity test. And I think that's the primary goal right now. Beyond that, if we can't do that, if we can't find a reasonable fix, then I think we have to look long and hard at how we split the rough grazing region on some sort of objective criteria. That is challenging in itself, but certainly there's the possibility of looking where that rough grazing is, because that's collected on IACS data, so we know it on a field parcel basis, and then overlaying something like a Macaulay type approach, which is land capability mapping, to say, well, there's improvable rough grazing on the one hand, and there's unimprovable rough grazing on the other, and paying two different payment rates on that. Now, that wouldn't be perfect, but it'd be a significant step away from having an absolute flat rate across 2.8 million hectares of extremely variable hill ground.
To bring in Patrick Krause about some of this, because quite a lot of that unimprovable land will be in crofting areas.
Thanks very much for that, convener. I was just about to start waving my pen, so thank you for that. I should start off by saying that I can't offer the technical detail that my colleague here can, because I only work part-time on agricultural policy. So I tend to speak much more in principles, I think. There's several things that strike me as the NFU lay out their table. One is that this idea of activity is excellent, and we fully support this. We were making this point in 2003, and we lost to the NFU, unfortunately, who were pressing at that time very hard for historic payments and for the single farm payment, and we saw what happened to the areas that I represent as a consequence of this. So it's really good that there has been a fundamental shift, and that we do want to have payment for activity. I think something that's very fundamental to this whole discussion as well, though, is that the CAP isn't what it used to be. And you know, I'm not trying to preach to the converted or anything, but I think sometimes it helps to remind ourselves that the CAP has moved through a very fundamental shift. And so to hear my colleague saying that we need much more regionalisation, I can understand it, of course I can, because by having more regionalisation, it keeps the money more where it is. And if I use the word redistribution, I'm sure Johnny's hairs are standing up on the back of his head. But the fact is that that's where the CAP is moving. It's moving to redistribution, and area-based payment is to try and ensure that more of this public money, and we must keep reminding ourselves, I think, that this is public money, this is taxpayers' money, this is yours and my money, as much as, and more so than it being purely an agricultural or a farmer's income support system. It's not that. This is about public money for public goods. And it's the government's responsibility, of course, to ensure that public money is spent responsibly.
To try and continue this dialogue just at the moment till we lay this particular piece of information to a point where we can take it on to other groups as well. But I think it's a fundamental point because it depends how Pillar 1 is distributed, whether in fact we see that development of a different kind of CAP rather than just the support for larger farms, if I can put it that way. So Johnny Hall is going to now justify that.
To come back, I mean, as you all know, the CAP is built on 2 pillars. And Pillar 1, let's be very clear about this, Pillar 1, yes, does have a public interest and a public good dimension. It is taxpayer funding. But the clear stated purposes of Pillar 1 funding are income support, are to underpin businesses, and it underpins businesses by cushioning them against volatility, both of input prices and output markets, and also, thirdly, to cover the costs of cross-compliance. They're the stated objectives of Pillar 1. Now, we are seeing a development of that in terms of the greening of Pillar 1 and so on. And yes, if you target that support in the right way to those producers who will deliver, you will see the multiple benefits of the local economies, looking after the environment through compliance issues and so on, and also delivering a social dimension as well, because you're retaining activity in rural areas. Now, it doesn't matter whether they're remote or rural areas and more extensive systems, or nearer the central belt and more intensive production systems, that's what you're underpinning. But if you do not target that limited pot of money, it'll soon bleed, as I say, onto relatively empty, if not completely empty hillsides, and we will not see any delivery of public benefit. It'll be pocketed. And we want to make sure that you drive it through those who are active and those who are producing, and the two things are interchangeable. Thereafter, you've got Pillar 2, which is specifically designed to deliver the public benefits over and above that through all sorts of different ways and means. And I think we're moving Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 closer together, and quite rightly so, but we need to be careful not to blur the whole thing. The CAP is not purely about delivering environmental gain and so on. We can channel that effort through sustaining farms and crofts across the businesses of farms and crofts across Scotland to allow them to then deliver what they already do by way of rural development.
Well, we've got 3 people who want to come in on this. First of all, Angus MacDonald, then Jim Hume, then Stuart Ashworth. So we'll try and get this particular question put to bed, if possible, in this round.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Picking up on Johnny Hall's point and recognising his issue with regard to empty hillsides, I've also got to pick up on Patrick's point. It's fair to say that there are concerns in the crofting communities at the prospect of rough grazing support being as low as €20 per hectare. And there are a number of concerns that such a low level of support may result in crofts no longer being viable. And that's a salient point that has to be borne in mind throughout the whole debate. It's not just about production, it's also about viable communities, and we could see there are concerns that we could see issues of land abandonment, rural depopulation, and a significant reduction in the numbers of store stock that are coming from the northwest of Scotland and the islands. So, I mean, clearly everybody's got a wish list, but do the panel feel that a minimum of perhaps €35 properly targeted in the crofting areas would go some way towards addressing the concerns with regard to depopulation and lower stock levels?
I feel like I'm dominating, but I do have an answer for that.
Well, please, you come in first, Johnny, and then Patrick.
I mean, if we look at what's being proposed right now in terms of the additional coupled support, which is the point that Alex Ferguson made, about how we can then target payment into this rough grazing region, whether it's in the northwest or the southwest or wherever. If you look at the budget that's already been earmarked for that rough grazing region through the Scottish Government's own modelling, and that's about €70 million. If you employ some of that through a coupled support mechanism, then we've done the calculations so far whereby you could reduce the base payment to €15 per hectare but you could then apply a payment per ewe on that same ground of about €30 per hectare. So that would take you into the region of €45 per hectare for the hill ground that's got a ewe per hectare on it. And that's in Shetland, certainly in certain parts of the northwest, but not everywhere. Thereafter, if you're on the much more extensive systems where it's a ewe per 5 hectares, you're in the order of €20–21 per hectare. But that's a much lower stock. So you're actually targeting the funding of where the activity is, whether it's in a crofting system or a farming system. That money is being used much more efficiently and much more effectively because it's linked, an element of it is linked to production, and production is essentially the activity we're seeking. And it's that that would then underpin farming communities and crofting communities no matter where they are.
And have you fed that into consultation?
We are in the process of constant dialogue with Scottish Government on how we think this could or should work, and that's going into the consultation. Obviously, the consultation is still open, but that needs to be fed in, and I think more people need to come and push on that, because it's utilising the same funding in the rough grazing region, but using it in a more effective way.
So Patrick, just on this point, I just wanted to come back on the low level of support being suggested. It was a bit strange that in the consultation such a low level was suggested, because my understanding is that the modelling that the James Hutton Institute was doing was saying, well, it went right. It was looking at models right up to €50 per hectare. So it was odd that they went right to the bottom. And even then, James Hutton was saying somewhere around €27 per hectare, you would get more winners in the crofting areas than losers. And I think this whole aspect of talking about winners and losers all the time is a bit of a red herring, because if crofters were getting very little and they'll get marginally more, well, that's not really winning, is it? It's not doing what we can do. It's just shifting things very slightly. And I think, you know, we've said that we, as far as we know, somewhere between 30 and 35 would possibly stop the land abandonment. If it's below that, there's this very real probability of further land abandonment. And I think just the point of, again, going back to a very fundamental point, is this idea that those on the better land who have more choice of what they can do with their business, who can rely on a market more because they're able to produce more, somehow deserve more of the public money to support them. And I think this, as far as I understand what is being suggested, is that 90% of the Pillar 1 money is to be spent supporting farmers in the better areas and 10% in the poorer areas. It just doesn't make any sense.
Right, well, we'll try and take this forward. We've got Jim Hume with a...
Yeah, no, just on the rough grazing. I mean, Johnny Hall's talked about decimation, and Patrick's been talking about land abandonment, which is quite scary terms to use. Obviously, sheep and beef are produced in rough grazing. I just wonder how, if anybody has figures, maybe QMS has, on the percentage of the Scottish beef and Scottish lamb is actually produced on land that is rough grazing.
Opportunity to comment. I don't have it with me, but I'm sure we can find some figures for you to put a handle on that. I would go all the way back to your original question, Convener, and I think QMS as an organisation recognise that we have to move to area payment. The challenges that we have been well articulated by Johnny, so I won't repeat them. But I would make a couple of other observations. We talk about sustainability, and from my point of view, sustainability starts with having sustainable economic activity and sustainable businesses out there. And I think I would debate the extent to which CAP has moved or should move. It has some serious questions to address there. And that leads me to sort of splitting the current debate into a debate about direct payment and a debate about greening. And in that respect, you know, I think the direct payment, which is designed to support, encourage the industry, and I would then draw a parallel with other policies that the Scottish Government has in terms of its food and drink agenda and the targets it's set for our industry. If we don't have the heartland of the livestock sector functioning and functioning well, then some of the other objectives that we have for the Scottish economy as a whole will be jeopardised. So I am very supportive of what Johnny has said in relation to the drift of the direct payment, the base payment, away from activity, because that will change the economic balance. And Patrick has already made the observation that it has changed the economic balance in the Western Isles, for example, who have had significant reductions in stock. But so too has been Dumfries and Galloway and the Borders. They may have taken a couple of years more before they started to move, but they faced up to the same challenges. So I think we have to recognise what the objectives are for our businesses in relation to having sustainable economic businesses, which then generate many of the subsidiary things that go from that and generates a base product which James and his organisation are aiming to promote and build.
I'd have to come back to the point that we visited Glenlivet in the summer with the members of the committee, and we were lobbied heavily by beef producers there, you know, about the way in which the split might take place, because they're presumably the engine room, as somebody has said, of you know, the Scottish agricultural industry in terms of livestock. So I just thought we ought to get a comment from members, if they will, about those prime beef producers who are starting off the food chain from their work and who feel that they might be the ones who lose out most in the uplands.
Yeah, if I start the response there, yeah. The good quality rough grazing and a better permanent grassland is the heartland of, I'm going to describe medium-sized beef production businesses, and they will be the ones that will be significantly challenged from an economic point of view. The guys who are producing the store lambs and who are producing the store cattle, now some of them will be rarer finishers and therefore they go the whole chain, but there's a high proportion of those people will trade those stock and are very vulnerable to the economic circumstances of the wider global market. And if those businesses start to withdraw, then there are serious consequences further down the line for store cattle finishers, for abattoir operators, for our red meat exports, and for our whole industry. So getting that sustainable economic change is a significant challenge for us. And I think we've probably lost that a little bit over the past decade or so.
So we're dealing with the situation that we've inherited, but is it the case that the package in the CAP as presently proposed can ensure that those absolutely essential parts of the engine room of livestock production will have a better future than they've had in the last decade?
The entirety of the package, and I will include Pillar 2 in there because I think there are some significant opportunities within Pillar 2 to help our red meat industry to develop and improve in efficiencies and so on and so forth. I think in the entirety of the package, there is a potential to create an operating environment over the next half a dozen years that will allow our business, our economic farming businesses to get themselves into a better frame of efficiencies to sustain a long-term economic activity. There are a whole host of other things within that mix that we could no doubt debate for the rest of the day in terms of age profiles and skill levels and new entrants and how all those elements build into the package. But I think there is a framework within the CAP to achieve those objectives. I'm not totally convinced that it is currently the current design proposals sit that the building blocks have been put together in the right order.
Well, I think we'll try and take that one forward. I think we should move on to the greening issues just now, because we have obviously got proposals which affect a lot of different kinds of farmers, and that as we move through the stages, it may be that we can pick up some of the points that Stuart Ashworth has made just now. Graham Day.
Thank you. Good morning. I want to look at how the greening measures should be implemented. In written evidence to the committee from the NFUS on the subject of greening, it talks of avoiding Scottish requirements being added which gold plate the EU standards. Now, a cynic, and let me declare an interest, I am such a cynic, might view that as an indication that greening in a general sense, not specific to this, but in a general sense, is seen as something of an inconvenience, not the right road to go down in agriculture. So in looking at the issue, perhaps contributors can provide reassurance that agriculture does buy into the broad green agenda, which every other area of Scottish life is buying into.
Thanks for kicking off there. Johnny Hall once again.
Well, we were cited in the question or the comment, so I think I've got to come back in there. I mean, greening is clearly an issue at a European level where the targets of that greening are to prevent monoculture, to create greater biodiversity opportunity through ecological focus areas, and also to lock in carbon into permanent pastures. Having said that, when you look at the Scottish agricultural landscape, you stand on any hillside anywhere, you do not see a monoculture. You see a whole sort of mosaic of different land uses and land types, agricultural activities, woodland and all sorts of things going on. I don't think we need to drive environmental concerns as hard through Pillar 1 as perhaps we should through Pillar 2, and utilise our agri-environment climate measures through Pillar 2 to deliver the things we want to. And quite clearly, the European deal through the Commission, the Parliament and the Council has come forward with a new amended set of greening rules that will affect farming across the European Union, which allows some exemptions. And it's basically saying, well, if the farming type is of a certain sort, that you have less than 30 hectares of arable ground and so on, or if Scotland as a whole retains its permanent pasture levels within a tolerance of 5% of existing levels, then there is no need for those particular farm businesses to adjust or change their practices. And therefore we would say, well, hence Scotland is essentially green already in that sense. And if we want to add additional benefits over and above that, that's the role of Pillar 2. And if we then go back to some of the food and drink issues that we're targeting, if you look at the Scottish Government's own analysis of how many farms would be affected by greening, it's predominantly the arable producer and it's predominantly the specialist grower. And those specialist growers, and the obvious example is somewhere in the northeast of Scotland who's growing malting barley that underpin the Scottish whisky industry. Now, if we then say to that individual, yes, you've got to now take 5% of your productive land out of production because of ecological focus areas, or indeed you cannot grow a predominance of spring barley, you have to now intersperse that with other crops as well, in other words, to satisfy a 3-crop rule or what they call a crop diversification rule, that hampers and hinders that particular business to meet a market demand. And surely we want the CAP to turn farmers away from being less reliant on the brown envelope and more market-focused. That's what we want the CAP to start us to do. That's the process that we should be in. But if we lock in conditions to such an extent on Pillar 1 support that actually prescribe the type of farming that has to take place, you cannot then be more responsive to market signals. You have to meet these conditions. And the point that we would then raise that, you know, if we want to go above and beyond those through some sort of equivalence scheme, some certified scheme, which has been rejected in the rest of the United Kingdom, then that would impede the competitive position of many of the more productive agricultural businesses in Scotland, because this really does apply in the arable sectors rather than the grassland sectors.
So if I can just come back on that, because I don't want to misrepresent in any way what you said, but that sounds to me like what you're saying is Pillar 1 is Pillar 1. Give us that money, that's fine. If you want us to be green, give us more money out of Pillar 2 and we'll follow measures through that.
We have done that, but the Cabinet Secretary has already taken the decision to move 9.5% across from Pillar 1 into Pillar 2 to underpin the spend on agri-environment. He's enhanced the spending on agri-environment, and as a consequence of that, the option is therefore available for farmers, crofters, foresters and others to deliver greater public benefit through that route. But as I said before, the underpinning purpose of Pillar 1 support is income support to put those farm businesses on a viable footing, no matter what they're producing, as long as they're active, to cushion against volatility in the marketplace, both for input costs and output prices, and then to cover the costs of cross-compliance. And every sector in Scotland is faced with a plethora of cross-compliance issues.
Yes.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you. As far as greening is concerned, I think perhaps Johnny misrepresents the purpose of Pillar 2, because granted there is an income support justification behind that, but the EU are very firmly driving us towards a more environmentally friendly farm business production base. From the organic point of view, we do have an exemption from greening, as far as I understand it, although I'm still waiting for clarification about how double funding might not be affected under the greening and Pillar 2 payments. Going back to the 9.5% transfer or flexibility between Pillar 1 to Pillar 2, we would, as an organisation, we would have proposed a higher rate of flexibility, and as I understand it, NFUS were quite happy with the 9.5. So they're going to I beg your pardon. So yes, we would have liked to have seen more funds available under Pillar 2, but as it is, the EU are directing us that greening is going to be in place. It has to be undertaken, and I personally don't think it's going to be as difficult as what it may seem. A 5% out of production of cereals is not actually that difficult. Organic farmers do it all the time through rotation. There are clearly researched and delivered environmental benefits to that. There are areas of almost monoculture in Scotland where we're looking at fairly constant wheat and oilseed rape rotations, and that is pretty much a dual culture. So there are ways and means of doing it. It's not as difficult as what I think some people are expecting it to be. We do have exemptions through the rough grazing, and all of these things are going towards what EU want us to do.
Okay. Are there any other people? James Withers has something here.
Thank you, Convener. And my interest here is from a wider food and drink perspective, a sector that's is the best performing domestic sector of the economy over the last few years and the fastest growing export sector. So how do we build on that? And the description of agriculture and farming as an engine room is absolutely spot on. Greening's important, and make no mistake, our environmental brand and our environmental story absolutely underpins our reputation both here and overseas. And I'll say something that almost certainly would have got me shot if I was still working at NFUS. Sometimes gold plating can be a good thing because it gives you a point of difference in developing your brand. And the reason we can stand up in front of buyers overseas and say that Scotch beef is better than Brazilian beef because it's underpinned by incredibly high environmental standards, animal welfare standards, etc. The concern I have around greening is twofold. One, supply, and we're going to have a bit of a shock factor around changes in Pillar 1 and reductions in support for more active businesses, which we've known have been coming for a decade, but nonetheless will be a shock factor for producers, and we need to use every power we can to give that landing or make that landing as soft as we can. Where greening might impinge on our production capability, then we need to think really hard about that. Because if we don't have that productive supply, then our food and drink industry targets are going to go out the window. The second thing about greening that worries me is that, I suppose in many ways, the C of CAP should really just be binned and abolished, because it's not a common policy anymore. It's impossible to have a common policy across 29 member states. And trying to establish a greening framework which fits incredibly intense productive countries, and one in Scotland where we have very extensive production, is very difficult and nigh on impossible. And I think if we could think about greening in the context of seeing ourselves as others see us, which is already an incredibly green, environmentally friendly, extensive production system, we are in an unbelievably good place in terms of that environmental record. The focus should be on maintaining that rather than adding further bells and whistles, because in terms of telling an environmental story, I'm comfortable that we can compete with anyone in the world in terms of our environmental sustainability story. It should be about maintaining that rather than, for me, adding more bells and whistles just now.
Okay, Patrick Krause and then back to Graham.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to add to a couple of things. That I think that the term engine room was first used by Brian Pack in his interim report that he did a couple of years ago. And I don't have the quote written down, unfortunately, but I remember that in that report there was also a statement that said something words to the effect of perhaps agricultural production cannot, or our target of agricultural production cannot be met without environmental damage. And I remember at the time us saying, well, that's not the way we're supposed to be going. You know, we're not supposed to just say, well, let's take the by far the greater part of the budget, of the CAP budget, which is Pillar 1, and turn a blind eye to environment and just hand it over as an income support and say, just get on with what you're doing because we have targets to meet. And the environment, well, let's just ignore that. Because this is the greater part of the budget. And to say, oh no, Pillar 2's for the environmental stuff, as Deb's pointed out, it's only 9.5%. It's not something that we should be proud of. Only 9.5% was put over to Pillar 2 when it could have been 15%. And if we really wanted to show that we're caring about our environment and we're trying to move in the direction of sustainable food production and land management, then we could have gone higher.
This is opening up a few more here. First of all, we've got Graham Day again.
Yeah, I just wanted to move this on a little bit, if I may, because fundamentally agriculture has a responsibility to reduce its carbon footprint like every other sector of society. And I would welcome some views on the emergence of the Agricultural Resource Efficiency Calculator. A number of the committee members visited Easter Howgate a few weeks ago to see the Green Cow initiative. And while we were there, we got a briefing on SAC's carbon calculator. Now, we were told that the basic version is available free gratis. There is a more detailed version that you can buy into. And they estimate it would take between 2 to 4 hours to actually complete this process. And I just wonder what the views are here today on whether we ought not to be introducing the calculator into the whole CAP payment process so that the amount a farmer receives is being influenced at least to some degree on the measured progress they're making year on year in reducing their carbon footprint. And we have the means to look at this, we just need the willingness to engage with it. I'd welcome views on that.
Well, we'll try and take people in order just so that we can pick up the last 2 points. William Houston, first of all.
Well, to put a bit of perspective from another part of the CAP, the intensive fruit and vegetable scheme insists that anyone who's benefiting from it has environmental improvements year on year. We are currently using SAC to do a carbon footprint across all of our farms. As Sainsbury's suppliers, we've signed up to their 2020, which insists on a 20% reduction in carbon emissions by 2020. And so we're very aware of it. And to come back to the initial point on the intensive arable greening measures under Pillar 1 is quite difficult for fruit growers with an area of very intensive, very productive land to then meet the cropping requirements under it. We would prefer that we were very green on some areas of the farm. Certainly not do any environmental damage on the intensive areas. Vice Convener might be pleased to hear we're doing a big thing on water runoff at the moment. is something we're being targeted on with big areas of polytunnel. So we're very aware we can produce a vast amount of very high quality food to meet the demand on some of the best land in the country. Again, I say we don't want to do any environmental damage, but the requirements of the fruit and vegetable scheme, combined with the potential requirements of Pillar 1 under the reforms, make it quite difficult to manage the productive area of the farm. But if that is profitable and there is incentive under Pillar 2 to be very green on the other areas, that would help produce the food and maintain the environmental benefit.
Can I just throw in something while we're going on to, first of all, Jamie and then Stuart? The idea of being able to counter micropathogens is probably one of the reasons why monoculture has obviously been targeted in this way with regard to greening. Whilst maize and wheat and the Ile-de-France and so on might well be a far bigger, or the southeast of England might be a far bigger target here, isn't it the case that we should be thinking about this in terms of what we produce, even in a bicultural, rape and wheat or malting barley sort of regime, which we want to be able to support, but is the greening about something more fundamental, as presumably Debs Roberts would be saying. Jamie? Sorry, Johnny, beg your pardon, I can't read my own. I can read your writing.
I mean, just to come back to that point, I think, for decades, centuries and beyond, the issue of crop arable management to reduce the adverse impacts of diseases, as folk over here know better than I, has all been about crop rotation, as you said yourself, rather than crop diversification. And if you look at any potato producer, for example, the issues of disease management are huge to the performance of that sector and how you manage that, and therefore that potato producing land is constantly on the move. That then creates that we're not growing the same thing in the same ground year in, year out across great swathes of Scotland. We're simply not doing that. Could I come back to Graham Day's point on carbon efficiency measures? We would absolutely back that. We see, clearly the agriculture industry, or the production end of agriculture in Scotland, has got to step up to the plate, as it were, when it comes to playing its role in tackling climate change issues. But if you look at the CAP as a package, that's not necessarily going to be delivered through the Pillar 1 stuff. That is far more likely to be delivered through the agri-environment climate options as they're now being currently consulted on in Pillar 2. And we would argue that you could introduce all sorts of efficiency measures into every production system, whether it's beef, dairy, cereals, whatever it might be, which will allow farmers to take measures to reduce energy use, reduce manufactured fertilizer use, look at how the systems operate to create efficiencies. Input efficiencies are good for the business itself. It makes absolute common sense. So part of this is an education and awareness thing, and putting in the right tools to allow farmers to appreciate their own savings, which are good for the bottom line of the business, but also have an environmental benefit as well. And the things like the Farming for a Better Climate initiative and climate change focus farms, we've been involved in that from day one, 4 or 5 years ago. That project's come to an end. We now need to roll out those ideas. Hence the reason why you've got an advisory system being built up in the new Pillar 2, and the targeting of support in such a way. And can I just come back on Patrick's point about the 9.5% transfer? The 9.5% transfer out of Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 equates to about 57 million euros per year. And in the previous discussion, we were concerned about eroding the amount of money available for base payments. We can't have it both ways. We would argue that if we kept more in Pillar 1 and targeted it in the right way, you get the rural development benefits you seek, because at the backstop of all this is cross-compliance.
Okay, right, well, we're going to try and pick up on some of these points about capping in just a moment, but Stuart Ashworth first.
Okay. Yes, the beef industry takes the issue of carbon management very seriously, and I've been involved for a number of years, locally and internationally, in trying to establish methodologies of calculating greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock sector. It is an absolute nightmare, but offline I'm quite happy to share with you some of the discussions that have been taking place and so on and so forth. I have applied the early SAC calculator in exercises that we do as QMS in terms of enterprise profitability for 3 years. The one thing that I would say is that any suggestion of using the carbon calculator as a key performance indicator on an annual basis, I could never accept at all. We have the circumstances that are well illustrated by the climate that we have had over the past 18 months, and the difference in the level of feeds and purchase feeds and so on and so forth that our livestock industry has had to use to maintain animal welfare against a lower production will completely distort any carbon emission calculation on the basis of a single year. Having said that, I pick up on what Johnny has said, that our industry has recognised that there are technological and production efficiencies that will deliver both a more efficient livestock operation and a reduced carbon emissions. And we have, through Pillar 2, particularly through the Knowledge Transfer Fund, but also through the Agri-Climate that Johnny has mentioned, a range of tools there that I think can be crafted in a way that will help to inform and demonstrate to the whole of the farming industry where technical efficiencies can be achieved that will help to sustain economic efficiency, but which will also reduce the wider Scottish agricultural carbon footprint. So, yeah, I think there are opportunities. I wouldn't particularly like to see as the carbon calculator exercise as a blanket requirement for producers, but I could see potential for it within the Pillar 2 exercise in some of those regimes where we can begin to roll and inform. And my final observation would be in relation to what our friends in the Republic of Ireland are doing in relation to their initiative of Origin Green, if I've got the words the right way around, James, where they are working along the lines of some of the things that you have said. And again, that's something that we can maybe take offline and have a wee chat with you about what they are aiming to do and how they are aiming to do it.
I think I'm wanting to try and wrap up 2 or 3 other issues in Pillar 1 at the moment, and then have a short break and move on to Pillar 2, etc. And the things that have still to deal with are additional capping of payments, new entrants in new sectors, and coupled support, just so that the people who have not perhaps said as much now will know that their chance will come. But perhaps it shouldn't be too long a session on whether there should be any additional capping of payments, since we've been discussing a bit about round about this just already. Any points that people have to make on this just now, other than the usual suspects? Right, Debs, first of all.
As a general principle, our approach to CAP reform has been fairness and simplicity of delivery. So, taking the first point, fairness, we are supportive of a CAP. We do feel that there are certain businesses, and some of those would have been touched on in our earlier discussion this morning, who have been perhaps, it could be argued, as over-subsidised in the historic regime that we have at the moment. But looking forward, we have a new way of interpreting and delivering the CAP. So, yes, we would support a CAP of Pillar 1 payments and degressivity as proposed.
Johnny Hall.
Yeah. Just clarify that there's actually no absolute cap in the deal that was the original proposal. It's now degressivity, as Deb's rightly identified. I think it's important that we make the clear distinction between how a cap might have applied to current levels and allocations of historic single farm payment today, and how degressivity might work under an area-based system in the future. And the analysis that we've done and Scottish Government done, clearly that that degressivity cannot kick in until you get to €150,000 per business, and that wouldn't include the greening payment. It would only be the base payment and any other direct support through coupled payments, and it can be offset against salaries and labour costs, etc. I think there'll be very few farm businesses operating on that scale and that size on an area-based system that will get anywhere near 150,000 in a base payment. And therefore, the degressivity issue, I don't think will be a major factor, because the very fact we're moving from a historic to an area-based payment is going to spread these payments out. We're not going to be in a historic system. We're going to an area system. We will spread these payments out, and it will be all about the level of payment rate per hectare that's appropriate for the type of farming systems you want to support. So I don't think, we don't view it as being a major issue or a major challenge. And if there are any funds from that, they can be diverted into Pillar 2, which is what is the requirement of the regulations.
Okay, thinking then about new entrants, it might be a chance for Roger McCall to say something here. We've noticed that at last there's going to be, a permanent means through National Reserve to ensure that new entrants have an opportunity in the new CAP. Are you happy with the proposals as suggested, or do you have further suggestions to make?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to be here today and to give some evidence. I think from the New Entrants Group perspective, if you look at any living entity, they need the ability to survive and they need the ability to compete, to grow. And if you overlay that in CAP reform, you will find that the proposals put forward by the Scottish Government to deal with the new entrants will allow them the ability to survive. But the ability to compete is another matter totally. I would also like to put that over 3 different timescales. We have the timescale from now until 2015, and remember, we probably won't get any direct money into our accounts until nearly 2016. Then we have a possible transition, which the government has proposed, and then we will have the level playing field after that. Now, we have had this phrase, the level playing field, mentioned numerous times, indeed by the Cabinet Secretary himself, yet I think there's a little bit of rowing back at the minute, and indeed the language has unfortunately changed in the consultation. It's now called a fair deal instead of a level playing field. So what the Scottish Government is proposing is a move forward, yes, absolutely. But is it a level playing field? Certainly not. Absolutely not. Come down into Dumfries and Galloway and you will find that, where you have people who now, in the short term, are trying to compete in grass parklets, in the livestock ring to buy livestock in tenancies, in auctions and so on. And I think there's quite a dangerous period coming up now. I know that from speaking to a number of my neighbours. They have found that because more and more information is getting out to established farmers, that the people with the bigger payments are coming in and they're offering higher, perhaps uneconomical values for grass parks for 2014 and trying to take that into 2015 in the belief that the reference year will be in around those 2 dates. So I think you're going to see a regression in certainly the area that new entrants, I'm talking about genuine new entrants now, that new entrants had on their IAX forms. I think you're going to see that going down, not going up. I'll be surprised if it continues to rise in the way it has because of this issue in the short term. If the Cabinet Secretary was here today, I'd be asking him to speak to his colleague, the Finance Secretary, and ask him for more money to fulfil the ability in the de Meneses, I think it's the pronunciation is, because the money that he gave last year, no one received the maximum amount, and therefore there is the opportunity to put more money out through the Scottish Government's own coffers to try and help in this intervening period. And I think that's something that should be done. I also think that it's, we've spoken about VCS, voluntary coupled support. Think about a new entrant sheep farmer. The majority are sheep farmers because they can't afford to get into beef. There's only half the setup costs to get into sheep. A farmer on PGRS land now, permanent grazing, no problem. So he's allowed an allotment of money, and the first thing that may happen to him is he may lose 13% of that through modulation, 8 of it to the beef sector. Now, he can't change his system now, or it'd be very difficult to go out now and compete against, it's £1,500 plus now to buy any sort of a breeding animal with a calf at foot, perhaps more. Again, we're back to this competition level. The people with the higher payments can do that, the new entrants can't. So he's there in that situation. He can't change his system in the short term, can't afford to do it, and the first thing he finds is that he loses 13%, according to some of the things we've talked about today. It's also worth pointing out that the National Reserve will be funded fully from the basic payment pot. It will not be, when we hear this figure of 3% taken off payments, none of that 3% is taken off historic. It's all taken off the basic payment pot. So therefore, the new entrant will lose, if it's a 50-50 phase in year 1, he will have to pay twice as much in comparison to someone who has some historic payment of the same value as the payment he's getting. Well, so instead of the 3%, it's then 6%. And I think there's going to be a figure probably on Friday given to the new entrants panel, hopefully, as to what this figure is. But we expect that figure to rise from 3, much greater than 3, perhaps double that, to meet the need. And so therefore, instead of the figure perhaps being 6%, to the new entrant it'll actually be 12, because he has to fund that all, or they have to fund that all through this basic payment pot, in comparison to the people who are getting a part historic payment.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. You've given us a lot to think about there. We've got a response here from Johnny Hall. I should just point out gently that I'm a convener, not a chairman. Not at all. That's the way we work in our Parliament here. Johnny.
A couple of comments just for clarification to what Roger's just said. I think in terms of the overall package that there is available for new entrants, and they tend to be referred to as young farmers in the European speak, because we have this 40-year-old bar on the whole thing, which seems a bit perverse in many ways. We should be targeting support at new entrants, regardless of age. The National Reserve is clearly going to be designed by Scottish Government in such a way that it does identify those categories of new entrant, and some of them have actually been farming for 10 years and more, that have been disadvantaged by the current system, and quite rightly so. We push that all the time. But that's not the be-all and end-all of it all. Scotland also has to allocate 2% of its gross budget to an additional top-up in Pillar 1 under the Young Farmers Scheme, so that will offer some additional support that the others wouldn't get. And equally, in the Pillar 2 consultation, you'll see quite clearly that the Scottish Government is proposing a new entrants Young Farmers Scheme, whereby it is establishing grant funding of up to €70,000 for new entrants to pay for machinery, equipment, upgrading of buildings, and, I'm told by Scottish Government, although it doesn't say it in the consultation, will pay for purchase of livestock. So if the new entrant is requiring funding to get in to a point where he can actually start buying those first few cows rather than being forced down the route of having to buy sheep because it's the cheaper option, then that funding is going to be available based on a 5-year business plan. You get a tranche of money up front and they get a tranche further down the line. Now that gives us something really quite new and different in terms of how we might support new entrants going forward. And we need to seize that. Obviously, funding's an issue because there are many competing demands within Pillar 2, but that's one that the Scottish Government should really focus upon.
We're happy with this particular bit of evidence just now. Do you want to come back, Roger?
A little bit on what Johnny has said. I also have a little bit on transition to do new entrants. Mr. Convener, I'm not sure if you have a question on that later on, or on transition.
Yeah, we are. We're going to just deal with that towards
okay.
the end of this section.
Just I'm not sure about, maybe Johnny might be able to enlighten me, as to the people that were already new entrants, whether they will come into this extra funding that Johnny has talked about, because there's 1,500 of them, so that's quite a significant figure. And I don't think that it applies to them. So that's again, we've got this void in between, which has not been filled.
Yes, Alec Ferguson.
Just to clarify that, are you going back to, how far are you going back? This is presumably to 2003, is it?
Are you speaking about the National Reserve?
No, the existing new entrants that you're talking about here. These 1,500 odd people, that's going back to 2003, is it? The last
as you know, there are people who started in 2000 who have 100 plus cows and 400 breeding sheep on tenancy farms and have never got a penny of single farm payment. So
clarify that for
the panel is fully aware of that, and they intend to go back probably to 2000 to pick up if funding is available.
I think, yes, very briefly, please.
You know, Scottish Government's identified that group that Roger refers to as a clear group that should be eligible under the National Reserve to access funding because they are a disadvantaged group. Whether they started in 2003, 4 and 5, they didn't have any historic reference element. They might have gone out and bought a handful of entitlements to help that fledgling business, but they're operating at a much lower level than their counterparts in the neighbouring area. And that's what the National Reserve is there for. That's one particular category. There will be other categories, again, developing businesses that have taken on new land, but also there will be new entrants from this day forward that also have to be accommodated. And that 3% of that further down the budget works out at about €9 million per year. The question is, will that be sufficient to satisfy the demand that Scotland might face for that National Reserve funding? And the key thing for us is we have to make it continuous. If you go back to 2005, we had a National Reserve for 1 year. If we'd taken the decision back then to have a continuous National Reserve, using a siphon on the sale of entitlements to fund it or whatever it might have been, then that might have prevented some of the problems that we're actually having to address today.
I'm not sure what the Scottish Executive's view about that was at the time, but I think we've got to move into the present just now. And we haven't dealt with the new sectors that are coming into the CAP just now. It might be a chance for me to bring in Andrew Ski if you want to say some things about that, because both fruit and vegetables are involved now. I'm glad to see a very important part of our produce in the modern food and drink industries.
Well, as you say, the potato sector is not particularly, it's very much on the fringe of the CAP right now. Obviously, most people growing potatoes are involved with CAP through other crops. But as far as the potato sector is concerned, I think we are just quite keen that there are no implications that disadvantage our sector going forward. A big proportion of potatoes are grown on rented ground. And one of the concerns is that we're speaking, people are trying to predict what's the reference year and what's the base situation going to be, and will it be difficult to rent land in that year? The landowners may decide that they want to keep the land and grow cereals on it, so that they're eligible themselves for the payments going forward. So that's probably one of the few implications that we are concerned about. In principle, I would be in favour of something that's got as much simplicity as possible, just working alongside people that are involved in these cereals and livestock enterprises, I'm sometimes disappointed to see the amount of management time that's devoted to looking after this side of their business, as opposed to management time involved in running the enterprises that I would like to see them devote all their time to. We're fortunate in potatoes that we don't have that distraction, but I do see that distraction in other enterprises.
Certainly questions that we'll be asking the Cabinet Secretary when we see him in due course. But thank you for that. Does William Houston want to make any points just now?
I think the only point really is to repeat what Andrew's just said, is we wouldn't like to see the fruit and veg sector being disadvantaged by anything. It's a very competitive UK-wide market we operate in. We're very close to our customers. It's very high value, but it's very low margin. So very small amounts of difference between ourselves and our competitors, colleagues further south can make a big difference to profitability. So we would just like everyone to bear in mind that being disadvantaged is probably the greatest worry to the sector.
But is our CAP proposal, likely to be any disadvantage or an advantage in the way that it's rolled out in Scotland?
I don't, from what I've seen, believe so. Only my earlier point of the cropping mix could create problems and force people to grow more crops than is economically sensible.
I think the potato sector would tend to use different land on different farms each year, and so it doesn't want the availability of that land to be cut short in whatever the reference year is going to be, this year or next year. Well, next year seems to be the one that people are worried about.
I think we've got that fair point. Debs Roberts and then Johnny Hall.
Thank you. If I might just offer a scenario within the organic sector that actually picks up on some of the points that have been raised just in the last 10 minutes or so. In Morayshire in particular, there is very good ground on which we have a thriving organic carrots, the growing of organic carrots, and it's a complicated supply chain or production chain, if you like, because carrots cannot be grown on the same field every year, so the carrot growers rely on seasonal lets of organic ground to grow the carrots. At the moment, the market is undersupplied. There is growing demand for organic carrots, and the trouble we're having is that we cannot get enough land of organic certification that we can grow the carrots on to meet the market. So if you go back a step, what we're seeing is difficulties with farmers who have the organic land availability. They're seeing troubles with trying to get seasonal reds, grass park lets, just what Roger was talking about previously. And so what's happening is down the line we're seeing a great threat to the ability of this established market being able to commit, because we simply don't have the certainty going forward for people to be able to commit to growing these vegetables that are of high value.
Johnny Hall.
It's a related point. It relates to Roger's concerns, and it certainly relates to the vegetable ground and so on. And it's all to do with how we deal with rented ground going forward. Just to clarify, eligible hectares in the future, in 2015, the default position that the Scottish Government will have to take, if it doesn't take another course of action on this, is that whoever's occupying that ground in 2015, if it's eligible, will get an area payment on it, so long as they are actively farming. And that in itself has triggered a response from some land-owning interest to say, well, I'm going to take some of this land back in hand, and I'm going to sit on it and wait and see, and I'll try and draw down this payment. That is a major concern for us, and I'm sure it is for SGFA and for the new entrants and for the veg producers. I know it is, speaking to our members, and it also relates to Deb's point. There is an option for Scottish Government to take within the regulations that says in 2015 you limit the number of area-based entitlements going to somebody who's applying for them to either the number of entitlements they activated in 2013 or the area they farmed in 2013. So you're partially, you're not 100%, but partially closing the door on somebody taking land back in hand and sitting on that land waiting for a payment. Now, Scottish Government have got to utilise that option. As I say, the default is that whoever's sitting on the land, as long as they can prove they're active, and that might end up in being some token farming, will claw that payment, and that will keep out the guys who have previously been actively farming that. And we've already got lots of anecdotal evidence to say that that's happening, because I'll have to watch my language a wee bit. Some of the interested parties, or the advisors to the interested parties, have been suggesting to those interested parties that they should maybe think about occupying that land and taking it back in hand. Now, that is a major, major concern.
I think your point is well made, and we'll bear it in mind. We've got a couple of things just before we take a short break. We've been talking a bit about coupled support, but probably want to deal with that a little more and transition from we've already sort of begun to touch on. So the coupled support element is something which you know, is the problem about the market and about the market rules and state aids and all that sort of stuff. But can we have any comments about the way in which coupled support should work? Alec Ferguson, want to kick us off?
Well, I think I'd be particularly interested in to know what panel members think. I mean, it's quite clear now since consultation went out that the situation is rapidly changing, and it now looks as if we're looking, hopefully, at 13%. The ability to go to 13% for coupled payments, and I think it's been indicated that while 8% will go to the beef sector, the extra 5% might be applicable to the sheep sector for reasons that Johnny Hall sort of outlined in his opening remarks. We are told in the consultation, or the consultation suggests, that coupled payments to the sheep sector would be extremely difficult, and I just wonder how it might be applied in order to, or how anybody thinks it might be applied in order to address the problems of the payments across the rough grazing region most effectively.
Sandy Simpson, Roger McCall, Johnny Hall, anyone want to kick off on this one?
I was going to go first, but I will say something. Surprise, surprise.
Anyone else want to say something on this just now? Yes, Sandy.
The difficulty that our members have perceived is that, one, if you try to implement some sort of assisted payment to, for instance, hill ewes, you have a huge regulatory burden to identify the ewes in the first place. And, I mean, it's a fact of life. If you put 100 ewes out on the hill, you won't take 100 ewes back. Some of them will disappear. That's nature. Possibly another way of looking at it might be that you paid some type of headage payment on the lambs that were actually sold off the holding. Now, I suppose that comes back to kind of like the calf scheme, because you tag the calf at birth, but you can't really do that in a practical sheep situation. The most practical time to do it is actually when you put them through the market, when they go off the farm, when there's verified numbers in a system that's traceable. And that might be one method of introducing extra money into the sheep sector. It might not meet with universal approval, but it's one method that could be implemented practically without too many extra costs either to the producer or to the government, because it already collects that information, and it would be a method of feeding money back to the sheep producers.
Okay. Johnny Hall next. Yeah.
2 points. I'll go first to Alex Ferguson's point, which was picked up by Sandy, in relation to how we might utilise this additional 5% coupled support. The real purpose of that, in our view, is to drive it through the sheep sector in order to then differentiate your payments on the rough grazing region, to get away from what I said earlier of a flat rate payment across very variable rough grazing region. We think that it's vital we actually use that. Having said that, recognise the complexity of how you do that, whether it's lambs, hogs, gimmers, ewes, individual head counts, and so on, is a challenge, and there is resistance about the compliance issues and what that might entail. Nevertheless, if you look at the regulations, we think there's some scope to actually do it on because it's coming out of a coupled envelope, that's where you could apply a stocking density. So you could look at a stocking density on a certain type of unit which has a predominance of rough grazing in its return, say 75% of it plus was rough grazing, and you could look at a stocking density to say that farm is carrying X amount of black-faced cheviot or whatever it might be. And it's almost going back to the days of hill livestock compensatory mounts when we had specially qualified flocks and they targeted support, particularly the type of hill use that we want to support in this context. You know, it's not that long ago that we also had a cheap annual premium scheme, whereby that was worth about €30 per ewe, and that didn't seem to be too much of a problem or difficulty for people to go through that process because it unlocked a payment. Now, this wouldn't be compulsory, this would be optional. And if people don't want to go through that, they can stick with the base payment, but then this coupled payment will be available for those who think it's in their interests to go and collect that information and apply and so on. There's always going to be an audit trail attached, but farmers are already complying with so much in terms of returns and data on the livestock they hold on their land at any one point in time. We don't think it's that difficult to come up with something meaningful. And I'm always reminded that there might be a silver lining at the end of all sorts of things. And the silver lining at the end of electronic ID for the sheep sector might be something like when lambs go through a critical control point at a mart, that technology can actually be used to verify the fact that those lambs exist. Now, sheep EID has just been a bane for the sheep sector for long enough, as you all know. This might be a positive way to use it if it means identifying production that's come from a certain type of hill unit that needs an additional level of support.
Okay, I wondered when we were going to get to EID, but I'm glad that we have. Ron Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Convener. Maybe just come back on that point there. I would be maybe a wee bit concerned if the coupled payment for sheep was used as a way to differentiate hill land only. I think that would be something that would require maybe a wee bit further thought. In other words, you're saying that this is animals that are only associated with hill land, and other sheep stock would not be eligible, and that would be a concern.
The reason why we would limit it to we estimate there's about 1 million hill ewes on this rough grazing region that we've got this trouble with. We've got about 2.5 million ewes in Scotland. 5% coupled support on existing budgets would give us somewhere in the order of €27 million. If you divide that by 2-odd million ewes on every ewe across Scotland, then it's not going to serve the purposes we want. If we limit it to the 1 million ewes on our rough grazing, and that's where we want to differentiate the payments in the rough grazing to attach support to where the activity is, then it does work. It means you're getting in the order of €27 to €30 per ewe on that ground. And if we're looking at low ground ewes, remember the low ground ewes will be on land that will get €200+ per hectare. So do they need that extra support to sustain that type of production system where, as Patrick might suggest, that sort of hill, sheep unit has got choice because it's on better ground?
Right, we'll take these points forward. I think we just want... Yes, Alec Ferguson.
But I have one more question about coupling. Yes. Thank you very much, Convener. Thank you. Very briefly, the purpose of the coupled payments going to the beef calf scheme are always acknowledged to be to underpin the critical mass that's required in the beef sector to keep the industry going, basically. I am bemused by how a scheme that rewards that pays the biggest payment to the smallest number of calves and then reduces those payments the more calves you have, encourages the retention or indeed the expansion of the national beef herd. Does it not make more sense, actually, to do it the other way round? You pay a small amount for the first 10 calves and increase it the more you have. And I just wondered if anybody had anything to say on that.
Stuart Ashworth.
I think perhaps that's the one I need to respond to. You make a very very relevant point, and we are doing a lot of soul-searching within QMS. Let me start from an objective. If the objective is to secure or increase livestock numbers, which from a QMS point of view, it very definitely is, then I am very sympathetic to the view. I don't think I would reverse scale, which is what you were suggesting there, but I am very sympathetic to the view that there is a single rate irrespective of the number of calves that you have got. There's a couple of elements behind that. One is the sort of Pareto principle of 40–50% of the calves lying within 18% of the businesses. And I was having an interesting debate with Sandy before we came up here as to, is it easier to get the big business to put 5 cattle on, or to find 5 small businesses to put a single animal each on? And we talked ourselves around in a very interesting debate with arguments for both sides. But I think that for the benefit of securing a volume of production, then discriminatory payments do not reward. If, and the original discriminatory payments were based against a sort of a environmental and economic issue, which in Patrick's area particularly, where cattle and sheep, mixed cattle and sheep grazing has particular value environmentally, and the Macker is a classic example of how that benefits, then maybe that is a different objective. That is an environmental objective that could potentially be funded in an alternative way. So I think, I'll go back to your original point, if our objective is to stimulate a greater production of cattle, then encouraging those larger businesses to put cattle on, I think, will be easier than encouraging small businesses to put cattle on. And on that basis, I am sympathetic to the view that level payment of the 8% that we were talking about is the best way of achieving that objective.
Just glad to hear it is being thought about and spoken about. I'm quite happy with that.
I think we'll try and move on to transition just now and then transition into a short break. Jim Hume.
Thanks for that, Convener. Yes, other countries have adopted more of a longer transition period from the changes in their cap. Obviously, no matter what system the government comes up with, there will be redistribution, as Patrick mentioned already, and some of that might be quite dramatic redistribution. Therefore, I just wonder what the panel's views is on having either a short transition or a longer transition period from the changes in cap.
We'll try and take a number of people. First of all, Sandy Simpson.
We've actually surveyed our members on what they would prefer. And we've actually, surprisingly enough, had 2 polarised views. Well, maybe it's not surprising. People like Roger, who are working very hard and making a damn good job of farming without subsidies, obviously want to jump off the cliff tomorrow. And people who have established very large single farm payment entitlements through mainly dealing in large numbers of livestock off a very small area, obviously want to hold on to that for as long as they possibly can. Now, there are arguments for both sides of the scale. We, as an organisation, would take it that possibly a more phased system over perhaps the lifetime of the Parliament, which would be the lifetime of the scheme, which would be 5 years, as it's suggested at the moment, whereby at the end of the 5 years we come out the other end on the level playing field, which has now been removed to fair play, that was talked about originally. That's the view that we are picking up from our members. From a strictly personal viewpoint, as an arable farmer in Perthshire, I first of all take exception to the suggestion that single farm payment is an income support. I have always firmly believed that the single farm payment was brought out to ensure that the people of the UK have a plentiful supply of affordable food. and the market is unable or unwilling to meet the difference between the cost of production and the cost of what people pay in the supermarket. That's my personal view. The other thing is that, as been alluded to many times previously, farmers in a low ground situation have options. Hill farmers have very few. And I think that we have not to lose sight of the fact that we have to support agriculture in the more deprived areas to a greater extent possibly than we are at the moment, because we've already seen large tracts, and certainly in Perthshire there's large tracts of the uplands that have no stock on them anymore, simply because, one, they can't get people to take the ground and farm it, and two, it's not economic for the people that own it to farm it. The other item is the Pillar 2 funding could possibly be redirected or more positively directed. Scotland's landscape is a result of agriculture. Our tourist industry is massive. James has already alluded to the fact that he's more than happy to sing the praises of it as an environmental country. So greening is perhaps not as much of an issue as might have been first mentioned. I would agree with Stuart that making us accountable for carbon every year without having safeguards built in about the effects of the climate on it every year would be a disaster for agriculture. No doubt of that at all. But that's just really some of the findings that we've had from the survey from our membership.
Okay. Other points on transition just now, very briefly. We'll bring it to a halt. Right, Patrick?
Well, we would just say that we'd like to see it happen as fast as possible. And it's a shame that as the process has gone on, the end point seems to move further and further away. And we'll talk about LFAS, for example. You know, that at the beginning of the process, it looked like moving to ANC. Yeah, and it's just an example of how everything keeps getting pushed further and further away, for obvious reasons.
Points well made. Roger McCall.
A number of points on transition, if that's possible. I think starting with really the PAC report, we see the other devolved administrations thinking about a phase in, I think probably over 5 years, similar to the consultation, but they didn't go into the detail really that the PAC report went into, and I think with the road shows and all, we probably could establish that the vast majority of the farming community know what was really the idea behind that and the findings of it and so on, and many of them read it and looked at how it would affect their business. So if we look at the consultation, and the Cabinet Secretary says that the majority of farmers are going to be better off under the system that he was proposing in the consultation, then surely the majority of these farmers since 2010 have been living in that expectation. They've been living and farming with the expectation that they're going to get more money, similar to the amounts that were mentioned in the PAC report, and now suddenly there's a possibility they're going to be told, hold on, wait, that money's not actually coming to you. We're going to keep it away from you for a number of years. I think that the other point would be, if we look at the different figures to do with QMS and so on, we see we have momentum with the amount of stock that we're losing, and we have to think of something to try and grow the industry. Perhaps I'm this youthful enthusiasm, but I would actually like to grow the beef industry. I don't want to see it falling. I don't want to see a continual decline with momentum, which historic has created. So therefore, how do you do that? I think the first thing you have to realise is, we talk about production and producers. What is the thing that is producing? The farmer is the manager, but it's the land, it's the hectare that's the thing is producing. Now, in my parish, we have people on £1,000 a hectare payment. And next door to them, in the same business type, the same land type, and to my eye, the same stock and density, we have people on 40. Now, that's wrong. Every hectare is important if we want to grow the agricultural business, the food and the drink business. Every hectare, they are like the spokes in a bicycle wheel. No hectare is more important than the other if we're comparing land capability. Yet we have 25-fold difference. Now, if you take that through a tunnel that some people are proposing, well, I'll let you go to the conclusion of what that is. But I think, again, from the youth point of view, we're looking at social mobility is something that I've been looking forward to mention today. The ability that for any individual farmer, through his efficiency, to grow his business and to expand it and drive it, just like we want to drive the food and drink business. Now, you cannot do that based on a historic where you have people doing the same thing and a vast amount of difference in payments. It is completely and utterly wrong. And again, another example, the reference years, the average age of the person who was farming was 55. That was back in 2001. We're 14 years on from that. So can we add 14 years to the 55? We end up with 70. If you want to have a tunnel, you end up with 80. Are those the people that you want driving the business forward, keeping them on enhanced payments? Stock reduction, I'd just like to say, we hear about this idea that people's payments are going to be reduced. There's going to be catastrophic loss of livestock numbers. We know, as I've previously said, people in Dumfries and Galloway, they're farming 100+ cows and 350 ewes on tenanted farms, and they've had no payment for 10 years. So therefore, does a high payment create fiscal incompetence? That these people cannot come down from 440, some say their payment is being halved, can they not come down from 440 to 220 with 5 years warning? I can't marry those two facts together when the other person has been farming for 10 years doing the exact same thing and gets no money.
Strongly put. Another point from Debs Roberts.
Thank you. If I may just echo some of the comments that have been made. Our organisation, taking views from them, similarly are quite mixed, and there are different polar views being expressed. Basically, the new entrants and those who have been penalised by low activity in the base years 2000, 2003 want immediate convergence as soon as possible. But that is with the caveat that as long as ARPID are in a ready state to handle that transition, because we don't really want to see a repeat experience of the difficulties that England experienced in the previous cap. So that was extremely harmful. So as long as we can urge ARPID to be ready to hit the ground with some urgency, we would certainly be wishing to see an immediate convergence. Counter to that, the people who wish to protect their historic payments, who were farming actively and don't wish to see those go, which in the interest of fairness, I suppose we would say that we would be watching for, we would be supporting immediate convergence.
Right, we've heard quite a number of different points of view just now. I think we'll take a short break and we will restart at 11:50. And I close the meeting just now and return in 5 minutes. start right now. Everybody come to order. We're going to be thinking about what we suggest the Scottish Government should do to deliver and implement Pillar 2, the SRDP funding in Scotland. And under this theme, we might want to consider in 3 parts what measures should be included in the programme, how the funds should be divided between the measures, and the application process and the assessment of applications, which we've touched on a little bit earlier. But let's stick to the first point about what measures should be included in the SRDP, and I'll be looking for anyone who wants to kick off on that one. James Withers.
Thanks, Convener. Just, I think maybe a point of principle. The others around the table are much closer to the detail these days than I am. But it strikes me in a fairly uncertain world that is farming. There's a few certainties coming forward. One is that direct support going into the industry is going to go down. There's no doubt about that. There's debates over the pace, but it will go down over time. And probably the cost of producing food and farming is going to go up because all the inputs we need are going to get more expensive. So over that time, you're going to have an increasing gap, sort of economic void that needs bridged. You posed the question a while back at the start of the session, which is, do we have enough tools in this CAP box to secure the future of the beef industry? And the answer is no. The CAP won't secure the future of the beef industry or any other industry going forward. Only 2 things I think will do that: the market and farmers striving to be better at what they do and more efficient. So what are the levers to help with that? To me, the next phase of SRDP and the next 7-year programme will be more important than any SRDP that has gone before it. And I think we need to look at every lever in there to help farmers become more competitive, to bridge the gap between, if you like, the poorest performers and the best performers, which is still an extraordinary gap and not just a product of geography or topography or peripherality. So I think we need to be imaginative, and I think we've touched on some of the areas. It's around climate change and efficiency, it's animal health planning, it's nutrient management, it's business planning, to get the farming industry into as fit a state as possible to survive in an era where direct support is going to keep going down and they'll have to survive in the marketplace. So that's my sort of point of principle in SRDP: be imaginative and support competitiveness.
Right, Nigel Don.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, everybody. Could I challenge that directly? Because the economist in me is asking why on earth we need to support any business that's in a marketplace. Its efficiencies should come from the need to compete in that marketplace. And if I put that back in a context, I used to make detergents with a rather large business. Nobody subsidised anything that detergent business or its major competitor did. It was entirely driven by the marketplace and our ability efficiently and economically to produce goods that the market wanted. Now, there are some differences, but could you please tell me why the differences in the food industry are significant? Why we should need to support anything at all?
I'll propose to respond to that on 2 fronts. One, 28 other member states around the country are going to tap into an EU rural development pot. We could take a moral high ground and say, do you know what, we're going to fight on our own, but I don't think that would be a sensible way ahead, given there's a pot there to be used. Secondly, I'll use a bizarre example, cavity wall insulation. So every single MSP in this building should, in the last 3 years, have revamped their cavity wall insulation. Whether or not you believe in climate change and saving the planet, but it will help that, it just saves money. It's energy efficient. So why hasn't every MSP and every person in this room done that? Because we're human beings, we're not always rational or logical. Sometimes we need incentives and levers to do it. Hence, there are grants there available to do just that. And I think, given you have a grant pot available, let's use it as a lever. I think it's worth remembering that, you know, for right or wrong, you've got a farming industry to some extent in some sectors that have been institutionalised into receiving support for the last 50 years and have been told that the market won't tell you what to produce, politicians will and Brussels will. That's changing very quickly, and you can't just change that overnight. So let's use a £1.2, £1.3 billion programme to create incentives and levers to move an industry into being more efficient in the same way actually other sectors do it, and use this as a transition window to get them into a fitter state.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just come in and support what James said. You know, the industry is constantly going through transition, some of it driven by changes in direct support payments, as we're witnessing now and have witnessed in the last few years, but others driven by the economic environment which they operate in the marketplace and so on. Input costs have been all over the place in terms of a rising curve. Output prices for most agricultural products tend to be on a peaks and trough basis. And planning and managing that situation means that farmers in particular have got to get a bit smarter. But as James rightly says, they are human beings. What we need to do is incentivise changing behaviours, changing practice. And the words that always get thrown back at me from Scottish Government are we're looking at transformational change that will put every business and every type of enterprise coming out of Scottish agriculture and land use in general across Scotland in a better place. But also at the same time, there is a demand and expectation that farming, forestry, crofting will all deliver a whole range of public benefits as well, in addition to the private or market-driven benefits of producing product. And that, I think that then puts agriculture in particular in a very different place from detergent producing and so on. So what we need to do in this rural development package is clearly attach significant money to the right sort of measures, but target those measures in such a way. The previous SRDP was a very blanket approach with little or no targeting. It was a shopping list in every region. And really, we had a bit of a bun fight of the biggest and the ugliest managed to unlock the funding, and we spent big blobs of money here and there. We think with a limited budget available to us going forward, we have to spread that more evenly and create a better access and opportunity to a wider range of farms and crofts across Scotland, so they start to individually change behaviours and practice, and then collectively that will start to make a difference. And some of those aspects relate to resilience, and it's not just physical or climatic resilience in terms of tackling the issues of climate change, but also delivering against biodiversity targets and so on. It's about financial resilience, being more able to manage and cope with those peaks and troughs that I talked about. And therefore, it's not just the measures, but it's some of the supporting elements within the SRDP that's being currently talked about, which become important. So the big headline spends are LFA support, agri-environment and climate, and forestry. But thereafter, you've got a whole tranche of the second wave, where you've got food and drink support, which is beyond the farm gate, but will create avenues and opportunities for farming. You're talking about funding for cooperative action, so you've got farmers collaborating far more than they have done to create benefits from that, and also delivering things on a catchment scale, which becomes important. And then also we're putting more dedicated resources into an advisory service, which actually puts farmers in a better place to understand not only what might be good for their business, but what then might also deliver for the wider public benefit that's expected of Pillar 2 funding.
Ronald Wilson and then Graham Day.
While I'm sort of disinclined to interrupt Johnny in full flow, which I'm sure we're all enjoying, there is a kind of an element here that we seem to be overlooking, which is really to do with the fact that any sort of government intervention, which is what you were really talking about in the first instance, does impact on structural change. It actually slows it down. So we've got a situation where, you know, we've heard about resilience, we've heard about human capacity, was really what you were talking about, James, there. And we have individuals within the industry which, either by dint of education, by dint of age, by dint of circumstances, might be in a situation where they're supported, which in other circumstances they might not be supported. Now, this is an uncomfortable truth that we're actually facing. So when you're talking about growing in industry, you're really talking about those individuals within industry that have that capacity to go on and who have the vibrancy, perhaps some of the younger generation, to go on and make something of the industry. So support for everybody in a blanket area basis, which is obviously what we've signed up to, I'm not disagreeing with that, does come with this disadvantage, which is in fact you've got an element of folk within that which perhaps would be better served being elsewhere within the economy.
Well, we're talking about our difficulties in terms of our geographical and landscape sort of situation and the soils we have to deal with. I think we've got a couple of people who want to come in here. First of all, Graham, and then Claudia. All right, well, we'll see.
Thank you, Convener. Johnny has reeled off a range of Pillar 2 measures which are accessible to farm businesses. But the NFUS has called for more money to be made available through Pillar 2 by cutting the forestry grant scheme, which is maybe a wee bit surprising, I think, given that the NFUS was part of the Woodland Expansionary Advisory Group, if I recall, and presumably was signed up to the proposals that are there that we're trying to, the targets we're trying to meet. But setting that to one side, there's a specific comment in the written evidence that talks about the possibility of achieving equivalent climate change goals through on-farm efficiency measures. Can I ask what evidence can be produced to back that assertion, to prove that it can be done? And can we get some understanding of what measures might be there to demonstrate how one would match off against the other?
First of all, yes, I sat on the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group, but I don't think I ever signed up to a target that said we would plant 10,000 hectares of trees per year for the next 10 years.
That not just rewriting history, that was an agreement.
It was never agreed by us. It's the Scottish Government. And the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group was about where you should plant trees in the most appropriate places. It wasn't about all signing up to that we all like the fact that 10,000 hectares of trees would be planted in Scotland. That's maybe an aside. What we're suggesting in there, and what we will be suggesting in our Pillar 2 response, is that we can continue to plant trees, but maybe not at that rate. We would argue that currently there's earmarked for woodland expansion £32 million per year for that 10,000 hectares. Back of the fact packet tells me that's £3,200 per hectare. We would rather see that target reduced to 5,000. You're still seeing woodland expansion on that engine house of Scottish agriculture. If that 5,000 hectares per year would cost, therefore, in the order of 16 million, we think that 16 million saved from the woodland grant allocation within the new SRDP could be better spent on some of the measures that Stuart talked about earlier on, and some of the measures that we can see being taken up in Ireland, for example, to drive efficiencies in more intensive production systems, particularly in terms of beef, dairying and livestock. And if it's talking about energy reduction and input efficiency measures, then I would suggest that, planting a tree and locking in carbon into a tree is one solution, but it's not the only solution to tackling climate change. Now, I can't put facts and figures on that right now, but I think putting all of our eggs, or almost all of our eggs, into that particular basket is a rather simplistic way to say, well, we can plant trees, we can lock up carbon, but at the same time, we have a limited area of productive land in Scotland. And once that land goes into trees, it is no longer available for food production, which undermines the food and drinks targets that the Scottish Government's also set.
We have to calculate just how much, and that's one of the issues that crops up. I mean, it's interesting to me that the third most popular investment by farmers in renewables is for wood fuel heating. Where's the wood going to come from? That's one of the questions I ask. Ronald Wilson?
I think the opportunity given to the farmers to plant some of their land with trees should be something that's actually removed from them. We're not talking about planting productive land that should be there for a forest only. And I think, the calculations that say it's 3,000 or 6,000 or so many £1,000s per acre to plant trees is not strictly true. As it stands just now, the Forestry Commission is actually struggling to get folk to plant trees. The 9,500 hectares that they say has got to come from the private sector. They're struggling with the level of grants. They don't think that that's actually sufficient. So we're not talking about, taking, I'm surprised to hear myself saying this, we're not talking about taking productive land out of agriculture.
People who've sold their land to the Forestry Commission because of the fact that they felt that they would get a good price for it.
And that's
the human behaviour of some farmers.
Yeah,
indeed.
Yeah. And give them that opportunity.
But it's market forces being driven by an incentive, because if you apply a payment rate of £3,200 per hectare, there's the incentive.
It's for a limited time. It's for a limited time. That's not every year, year after
year.
year.
But
for farmers under circumstances, it makes sense. for farmers under certain circumstances, it makes sense for them. And to provide them with that opportunity to make that choice, I think is right and proper. If you want to restrict woodland planting, then restrict it through the planning process. Quite easy.
There's clearly scope for farm woodlands of a certain scale and a certain type, and they can be beneficial to many farm situations. But once that hectare of land, if it is on productive land, is under trees,
it's gone.
You say that's moment in time. It's not. It's gone.
Yeah.
And we have a very limited supply of productive land in Scotland. And we are eroding it all the time. Sorry.
So before we move on...
So to be fair to the NFUS, they've made the point. Do other witnesses share their view that the balance of the proposed budget is wrong in terms of the forestry grant scheme, or is it just the NFUS that feels that way? I mean, we've got other farmers here. So.
Just can I add to that, which may help, because one of the situations that I see, and this is where maybe the Scottish tenant farmers come in, that really planting trees is really only a valid option for owner-occupiers or landlords, because tenants, there's no interest in planting trees. So therefore, that's maybe sets it up for Sandy. I don't know.
Yeah. We have two worries about this. The first one, as Jim rightly pointed out, this is not an option that's open to tenant farmers. The second is a much more worrying trend that the Forestry Commission is actually actively buying land. It's outbidding farmers with taxpayers' money, which is often a fact that's forgotten. So you and I are all paying for this land. They then, some of the farms they've bought, the tenants have been put out of in order for the owner to sell them. Some of them, the Forestry Commission, have planted the areas that they wish to plant, and then gained massive brownie points in publicity by offering starter farms, which Roger's obviously smiling about, because like us, he doesn't really think that they're viable starter farms in a lot of cases, because the best land's been taken out of them. Now, it's not only the Forestry Commission that's doing this. Private enterprise is investing in forestry because it has tax efficiencies, tax benefits for the people that are doing it. If we're trying to encourage forestry, there's vast areas, or not vast areas, but there are areas on every farm that you could go into that would be suitable to plant trees on. Possibly half a hectare here or a hectare more here, made up in small areas. It requires a fundamental change in the legislation, one, to allow tenants to take advantage of these schemes and to do that, and two, to allow them to have some form of compensation if they go ahead and do that, but their tenancy expires before that woodland can be harvested. Because as it currently stands, the landlord could come at them at the end of the tenancy for a dilapidations claim, because they've turned that land from what was arable land at the commencement of the tenancy to, as Johnny rightly said, the hectares now taken out of production. So that's the other side of the coin. So you can't have it always. Your comment about wood fuels, yes, at the moment wood fuel boilers are riding on the crest of the waves. If you go back a few years, it was wind power. Wind power is not an option for tenants either. Most renewable energy isn't an option for tenants because they can't either access an agreement with the landlord or access the funding. You talked about measures in Pillar 2 going forward. I think we do need to be more careful and try and target the money more effectively, in that instead of having one or two great big schemes, we have possibly 50 or 60 much smaller schemes. Now, you could argue that giving somebody a large grant to build a pack house to further process produce creates a bit of employment in that area and puts money back into the wider rural economy. But if you targeted the same money between 20 or 30 small rural businesses to allow them to diversify, you might find you create possibly more local employment and, going forward, provide industries that can secure a small family farm into the next generation and possibly beyond. And it also achieves your other goals in that you're keeping people in the rural environment, you're creating local employment, and possibly the rural business does not become so reliant on the payments that it's currently receiving from Europe. Because, as was rightly pointed out, the way the payments in Europe are going, they're going to be minimal in their terms of impact on the farm business. And I would be suggesting at the moment that we might see a reorganisation in the farming structure in the UK, and certainly in Scotland, over the next 5 years, because what you will find is that the people that were alluded to as being subsidy junkies, for a better word of it, and are inefficient, will go out of business. Now, part of the measures being talked about in Pillar 2 was an increased advisory system. And I'll tell you an interesting little story about that. In Perthshire, there was, sorry, this is factual. In Perthshire, there was a large landowner who used the college, the Scottish Agricultural College, in the days when it was free. He didn't take their advice, but the local advisor went in to see him 5 years later when he saw him implementing his proposals. And he was told in no uncertain terms, oh, but I employed a firm of consultants. They gave me the same advice and charged me thousands of pounds for it, so I had to do it. So implementing a free advice system doesn't necessarily guarantee it will be taken up. It will be taken up by people like Roger, who are forward-looking, young and want to go ahead, but the people at the other end of the chain who are basically looking at the single farm payment as a retirement system, it's not going to affect them at all. So the money that's going to go into that may not be fully utilised, is what I'm trying to say.
Right, we've got to deal with the question about application processes and assessment slightly later on. And if there was 60 schemes, that would be even more difficult to administer. But anyway, the menu has got to be looked at later on. However, there are other points here. Patrick wanted on this one, and Nigel wanted back in as well. Patrick, measures.
I was just going to make a comment about the forestry. SCF was represented on the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group, and one of the things that we pointed out at the start was that crofters have already gone a long way to meet government targets under the crofting forestry scheme. So forestry is really good for crofting, but I think something that interests me quite a lot is what are we growing the trees for? If it's for fuel, then I think crofters would say, yeah, that's really good and it's the way to go. But if we're talking about putting trees in for climate change mitigation, for carbon sequestration, I think that I'm right in saying that trees actually aren't that efficient compared to peatlands. And peatlands, and it's a huge difference. I can't actually remember the figure, but it's tenfold that the same area of healthy peatland will sequester 10 times or so amounts of carbon than trees would. So I think that we should be looking more at peatland management, and this should be part of what we're aiming for in Pillar 2. Is active peatland management. For example, conservation grazing.
Can I just come in on that peatland issue? There is an earmarked £15 million in that agri-environment climate, which is specifically for peatland management, and that was announced by the Cabinet Secretary some time ago.
It was indeed. I'm going to try and get some of the other measures dealt with, given that time wears on. Nigel Donne wanted to come back about support, but
Thank you, and I'm very happy to get on to the other measures, but I want to pick up on what it was I think Johnny Hall said about grants being to fuel efficiency. Sorry, I don't think I buy that. Grants are to get people to do things they otherwise wouldn't do. Efficiencies in any process are things you do because they are effective in improving the efficiency and they are cost effective. And I'm very worried when I'm hearing anybody suggesting that we need to give people grants to do something they should be doing anyway.
That's an interesting observation. I mean, it's the role of government to incentivise change in behaviour, I would think, in many respects. Now, you either do that through a legislative route or you do it through an incentive. So it's stick or carrot, but there's a third element called advice. And it's an awareness and advice, which is clearly part of this delivery stuff in SRDP, which is important. Yes, as James alluded to, and I think Stuart alluded to, we all want our bottom performing farmers in every enterprise and crofters to move up. But you don't necessarily do that by just saying, well, the marketplace will look after that. I think otherwise you then lose many of the other rural dimensions that you get from that, actually having people in place in those locations and so on. So you need a combination of incentive, and it's this issue in many ways of provide the incentive once, change behaviours once, and then once that benefit has been realised, and a classic would be soil sampling and nutrient analysis on grassland farms, arable farms, whatever it might be. Yes, the best farmers are doing that already, but there is a rump of inert sort of farmers who are not doing that. You incentivize to do them, they realise the benefits, there are clearly benefits in terms of climate change and water quality, but there's benefit for the business. So they will continue to do that in the future themselves. It's pump priming, for want of a better expression. Changing behaviour, let people realise that. And you underpin that through knowledge transfer and innovation, which is another element of the SRDP, and that's demonstration, best practice, benchmarking, and every sector in Scotland could benefit from that, so that people do realise that actually cavity wall insulation saves me a few quid, therefore I'll do it, but it also does something for the planet.
We're going to have to try and deal with some of the other elements in the SRDP just now. Claudia Beamish wants to run a line of questioning now, please.
Thank you. Could I ask, throw two questions in about other measures? One is about the business support for food and drink support. We've heard quite a lot about food and drink from the production side, but as panel members will know, there's support proposed for food and drink SMEs in the form of start-up grants for new enterprises, and also business capital grants and non-capital investments. Do any of the panels see that there should be criteria in this? We've got our targets for food and drink, and we've got our export targets, but do any of the panel members see that there should be targets for those applying, criteria for those applying in relation to how accessible, affordable and local food can be produced for rural and urban communities? So that's my first question. And my second question is about the cooperatives and whether panel members see that as beyond farmers, and whether local businesses and farms and communities could be working together in a cooperative way with that new fund.
Okay, William Houston, first of all.
Well, I would like to support both of those initiatives. I'm kind of duty-bound to, as I manage a cooperative of 18 growers, marketing directly to the end customers, and I see huge benefits to those farmers in doing that, both in getting a greater return of the total food spend back onto the farm, and equally importantly, the very close contact they have with their supermarket customer buyers, in that every year they meet the buyers face to face. And I come from having tried to do this with meat, with various degrees of success in various countries, but to see it working successfully through a targeted fruit and vegetable scheme, I believe there are huge potential benefits to Scottish farm businesses through doing this. We have a superb support system through SAOS and Scotland's Food and Drink. We've got the infrastructure there waiting to help farmers earn more from the marketplace. And to tie things together a bit, if the role of these grants is to a one-off payment to help businesses become more sustainable, it's a great opportunity to bring more of the end price of food back into the farm business or the rural community outside the farm business to make a sustainable rural economy. So I would fully support both of those measures.
Yeah, just I suppose add to the consensus, I would completely agree too. I mean, agri-food cooperatives in Scotland are the complete unsung heroes of the food and drink industry. You know, I suppose they don't sort of shout from the rooftops. SUS do phenomenal work, but they don't shout from the rooftops. And the future of food and drink and farming will be collaboration. I mean, food and drink, 80% of food and drink businesses in Scotland employ less than 10 people. They are small by nature. The future will be collaboration to achieve scale. Food processing and marketing grant scheme, a relatively modest amount of the SRDP pot historically, has been transformational for a lot of food and drink businesses. It would be critical that that area of spend is supported going forward, and I would certainly support rigorous application criteria, and that would include criteria around how they contribute to growth of targets, which is both local markets, national across Scotland, national across UK and international. And an assessment based on how they contribute to that would be critical. But the more support you can throw behind cooperation and collaboration will be the absolute key for Scotland. And we know that because other countries have been better at doing it than us historically.
But we've got to get better at doing it ourselves.
Yeah.
Patrick.
I just want to support that. Basically, the food processing marketing support scheme has been really good for us in crofting and helped us to develop or at least the first part of a development of a Scottish crofting produce mark. And I just think this is the way we've really got to go, because as James said earlier, Scotland's got so much to sell as iconic food. QMS, for example, I always use this example of the guy in the kilt. There was this great photo of the guy standing there, and behind him is the Old Man of Stour in Skye. And this is the image that we're trying to sell. And the more we can help to develop small businesses to sell directly, the better.
Okay, I think we've got Stuart who wants to come in at the moment.
Thank you, Convener. Just one very small point. Certainly, at my reading of the consultation, the discussion on cooperation seems to be an emphasis of discussion on land management issues, whether that be, and particularly drainage is the example that's used. What I would urge is that reference to cooperation takes cognizance of the debate that we've had here in relation to business cooperation to drive forward market opportunities. I'm happy to be corrected if I've misread what the SRD consultation is saying, but I am concerned that if my reading is correct, that the cooperation that's been talked about is landscape management cooperation for environmental gain, not business development cooperation.
Okay, that's a point we'll take forward. I want to raise a point about CAGs just now, since it's one of the areas that affects the Highlands and Islands, and I'm the only Highland member here. We know that around 5,000 crofts claim single farm payments. We know that there's about 11,500 farms and crofts get LFAS. And we see that the government's been consulting about how the crofting and small farm support scheme should be run. Now, it's got a figure of £20 million in here. Is that an increase from what the CAG's grants were in the past when they were more restricted? That's an indicative figure.
Yeah, it wouldn't be an increase. It's a bit difficult to work it out exactly, because if it was opened up to the whole of Scotland, which is something like 34,000 units of under 50 hectares. But bear in mind that's the majority of units in Scotland, because the average is about 54 hectares or something, I think the average is. But it opens it up by a vast amount and only increases it by 30% or whatever. So if all of these people were to apply for it, then the budget would go instantly. And so per potential applicant, the budget is much lower.
So the question is, if it were about 35 or 37,000 smaller, many of these must be outside the less favoured areas. if you know, at the present time, farms and crofts are around 11,000 or so.
Yeah,
do
they're
we
outside
think...
the crofting counties.
So the crofting counties, not less than there.
Yeah.
So they're outside the crofting counties. So the idea is that you try and max this up in terms of numbers, but you don't actually increase the amount of money at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, it's quite
not
clear.
in the same proportion.
No, I understand the proportion, but I wanted to get that from you because clearly we want to ask why that potential change has been suggested. And just to ask, you know, about the CAGS grants, what particularly makes it so important for crofters to have these?
Well, the grants were, they originated, my understanding is that they originated from the Congested Area Board times. So they're very old, these grants. And they were there specifically to target units in a very marginalised area. So, you know, so we would still support that argument that many and most crofts are still in very fragile, remote, marginal areas. The question that you asked, why has this been suggested, I really have no idea, and it certainly didn't come from the SCF, or for that matter, anyone else that I know of. The only time I've ever seen a suggestion of it being opened up to non-crofters was when we prepared a report under the cross-party group on crofting, and the working group prepared a report on crofting scheme, and the NFU member of this group suggested that it should be opened up to non-crofters, and no one else in the group supported that suggestion. Now, we're actually going to present a paper on this because we think that there's something odd about, if you read the stage 2 consultation, it refers to the stage 1 consultation, and it's not accurate the way it reflects what was said in the stage 1 consultation, because there was widespread support for a croft-only scheme, and the figures that they've been using aren't accurate. And I won't quote it all here. I'll send a paper to the committee, if I may, and we'll be bringing this up with the Cabinet Secretary next week.
Indeed, well, I'm quite sure that we want to see your paper because we'll be asking the Cabinet Secretary for his views 2 or 3 weeks' time. Johnny Hall.
Can I comment on that? Clearly, we support the proposal to extend CAGS to small units, small farms. But just for clarity, to be absolutely certain, we do not support the extension of that beyond the crofting counties. We've always argued, as it was the case before, that non-crofts in the crofting counties, but of like economic status, as always what should be enabled to access the same grant support mechanisms as crofters. And that was the case up until 3 years ago, when Rosanna Cunningham at the time took the decision to remove the like economic status criteria from non-crofts in the crofting counties. So our response will say that we support this move, but it should be contained within the existing crofting counties, not across the whole of Scotland.
Right, okay. Graham,
can I just ask for guidance from Johnny Hall? Do you have an idea of the figures that are involved here? How many businesses would be?
No, off the top of my head, but the Scottish Government should be able to provide that simply from IACS returns as on a regional basis in the crofting counties of non-crofts of under between 3 hectares and 50 hectares. But it will be a significant number, it will be a huge number, but I can think of examples in Orkney, for example, where you've got farms rather than crofts, but they're operating in a very similar environment, neighbouring with crofts on many occasions, but they don't have access to the same production-related grant support that the Crofting Counties Agricultural Grant Scheme offers.
Patrick Krause.
The argument that was put up by the Scottish Government for taking away the grant from like status holdings was that the 2007 Act gave these holdings the ability to convert to crofts. And so the logic was, if you want the crofting grant, become a croft. Now, it has been argued that it's not actually that easy to convert to being a croft. And so our argument then is, well, work on that legislation. Make it easier to change small holdings into crofts. Because there is a difference. And I know the outputs and the outcomes of crofting, farming, small holding in the same area. If they're producing the same thing, then they should be supported. And I absolutely agree with that. But then the counter-argument is, well, why is one sector regulated under specific legislation and the other sector isn't? So therefore, convert to crofts.
I think in the situation that we're talking about, we can't go into crofting reform in this round table. But in my reading of the Crofting Commission's website this morning, it talked about crofts and small farms. And as it says a crofting and small farm support scheme, and it seems to be being called that at the present time. So whether they haven't caught up with 2007 or whether they're anticipating things, I don't know. But clearly there's a big debate being had about whether there should be one form of tenure in areas like the Highlands and Islands, which is another matter. But I wanted to get that clear. So in other words, we'll look forward to your paper and we'll try and take that forward. Well, we've dealt with quite a lot of the measures that people seem to have raised matters on that were pertinent. We should look particularly at how the funds should be divided between the measures. If there's any points on that just now that people feel they want to make, however briefly, that would be a help. Patrick.
Sorry, can I just ask for clarification? Are we going on to LFAS at some point, or should I raise LFAS now?
No, you can raise LFAS just now.
The point that I want to raise about LFAS is that, as you probably well know, we've gone on about this for a long time, as did the Shucksmith inquiry, as did the Royal Society of Edinburgh inquiry, point out that LFAS isn't being used in the spirit of a less favoured area support scheme, because the way the formula works is that what comes out of the other end of the formula is that higher payments per hectare go to the better land in the less favoured area, which is most of Scotland. So we're using a less favoured area support scheme to support more advantaged holdings. Now, at the beginning of this process, we were very hopeful that the ANC was going to be brought in, the areas of natural constraint, which is much more specific about putting money out to where the constraint is the highest. But we're told now that this isn't going to be brought in until at least 2017, 2018. This is what I alluded to earlier, moving that day further and further away. And so we asked that if LFAS is going to carry on, then it needs to be revised, and that the figures the shift the payment, that invert the payments basically, are moved so that more money is going to the more fragile areas. But we were told by the Cabinet Secretary in the CAP stakeholder group a month or so ago that this won't happen in the foreseeable future.
Good point in that. We were talking about the measures at the moment, but particularly we're thinking about the division of the funds within the overall pot for SRDP. If any of the other members in the round table today feel that they want to say anything about that, because if they don't, we'll move straight on to the administration of the application process and the assessment of applications. Now, you know that the system has being invested in at the present time, aiming to deal with under £75,000 grants at local level and above that in a national panel. Do any of you have views about the workability of this, etc.? Johnny Hall.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, we have particularly strong views about the proposed approach. We endorse and back the idea of introducing different levels of entry. So you have your level 1, as you say, which is under 75,000, being assessed locally against local targets and priorities, and above 75,000 being assessed against national objectives by a national panel. We think that's a good step in the right direction, but we don't think it's gone far enough. What we proposed in the Stage 1 consultation was you actually have 3 levels of entry, because what you want really is your first level of entry to be between under 10,000, because if we're talking about accessibility of relatively small-scale measures on farms and crofts across Scotland to change behaviours in practice, then it's modest amounts of investment. So we think we should have a competitive level, and it has to be competitive for funding reasons, at that lower level. Then have a next level up between £10,000 and £50,000 of investment, then over £50,000, you would have that national approach. And we would not be opposed to sticking a cap on the whole thing anyway, simply for budget management purposes. So 2 levels of entry is good. 3 levels of entry would be better, because it would open up the access to a far greater range of farms and crofts which actually require, whether it's business investment or environmental investment or whatever it might be, they would actually benefit from going in at that level in many, many cases. And it would be as easy to manage the budget in that context, because you could set limits on how much you set at each level and so on. So the proposals are adequate, but they could be better in terms of broadening out the accessibility of funding. And that one of the major criticisms of rural priorities, as you know, was that we spent big dollops of money in limited number of projects and basically excluded a whole range of other opportunities for others. We would like to see that changed. And when you've got limited funding, again, you have to be quite careful. So that first level of entry, we think, is absolutely vital.
Interesting points. Any other points on that just now? Sandy?
I would like to agree with most of what Johnny had said. We would favour a lower limit for a lower level. But the 2 things we would really like to see is a far simplified application system, and because at the current time you spend a lot of money preparing all your plans, which if you're unsuccessful you've lost, which deters an awful lot of small businesses from going forward to applying. And the second thing we'd like to make sure, I think as Deb's alluded to earlier, that SIGPRID are up to speed, or at least their local area officers are up to speed with all the details of the plan, and we don't find that we're getting some information from them today which in actual fact is less than 100% accurate, as we have discovered with some schemes in the past.
Very much. Points made. Debs, you were mentioned.
Thank you, Convener. As far as the threshold of £75,000 is concerned, it's an arbitrary amount. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference, I don't believe. I think far more important is what Sandy's been talking about there, and the application process, and much more the approval process. Certainly the current system that we have within the organic sector was extremely difficult to have impartial views made of assessment of cases that were put forward to local case officers. And I don't quite understand how it is so difficult to separate the advisory role and the assessment role. There are UCAS principles based on absolutely polarised differences. Oil and water situation. Advice cannot touch assessment, and that is how organic certification is actually managed according to UCAS. Any sort of accreditation, whether it be the QMS Scotch beef label, right through to BRC, advice cannot touch assessment. And I would like to see those principles being introduced to the way that Pillar 2 SRDP proposals are considered, so that there is clear separation between a case officer on the ground who is working with and advising, and that might be touching on advisory service, which is also in the scheme. I have more concerns about that. But that must be clearly separate as to the assessment, which must be much more targeted and criteria set.
We're all happy with that so far. That has given us plenty to go on. Okay. A final area of our concern just now is what are your views on the budget allocation decisions made by the UK Government and the Scottish Government? For example, regarding transfers between pillars. And do you have any messages to inform the planned review of UK CAP allocations in 2016-17? Right, who wants to kick off there? Johnny Hall?
Well, we're talking about two things, I think. We're talking about internal convergence, or the convergence dividend, in terms of the UK allocation of Pillar 1 funding. Clearly, there was a very strong argument that the dividend that the UK received from the convergence criteria set at a European level should have been passed on, not entirely, but almost entirely to Scotland, because it's the very fact that Scotland's got this huge area of rough grazing that gave rise to the UK average falling below the European average that then gave rise to the funding available. That is a very important political argument, but let's be slightly realistic about how much funding that would have then generated. Even if Scotland had got it all, it would have been £11 million in 2014, rising to £60 million by 2019. So that's one element. The other element is that Scotland has taken the decision, as we said earlier, to take 9.5% out of Pillar 1 across to Pillar 2, which works out at €57 million per year, which is actually greater than the amount we would have drawn down through a convergence dividend. Now, in terms of the review that's been flagged up about the budget allocation, and clearly DEFRA have committed several times to the Scottish Government and to ourselves that that review will take place in 2016. There are two elements to that. It needs to be done on absolutely objective criteria, which assesses the payment rates that go to similar types of land across the different parts of the United Kingdom. And we can only do that process once Scotland has established its own payment regions, so that we have an arable payment, a grassland payment, and a rough grazing or moorland payment, which we can compare to England, Northern Ireland and Wales. Then when you look at that, you then establish what would be a parity of payments on that basis, and that would definitely drive money into Scotland. But it wouldn't drive all of it, that convergence dividend. It wouldn't come all of it our way, but it would significantly help with our budget dilemma. The next part of that budget review is that clearly there is a debate and discussion as to whether, once that review is carried out, whether you can implement such a change within this programme period, or do you have to wait till 2020? We would argue that you have to go from 2017 onwards, but we can only do that once Scotland's established its own payment regions, so that we can then draw a clear objective parallel with the allocations of payments in the other parts of the United Kingdom. And I'll just finish off by talking about that Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 transfer. Scotland's at 9.5%, as you know. England will be at 12%, which has pulled their budget down, so that's helping us to move towards parity. I'd rather move upwards towards them than them coming down to meet us, having said that. And Wales will be at 15%, which again helps to bring us closer to the level of payments which will apply in Wales on an area basis as in Scotland. But finally, I might add, Northern Ireland's Pillar 1, Pillar 2 transfer will be 0%. That leaves one of our main competitors within the UK family very much at a greater advantage in terms of higher payment rates in Pillar 1 and a Pillar 2 budget we can only dream about.
Okay. Special circumstances in Northern Ireland, perhaps. Indeed. Thank you for that. Anyone else here? We've got Patrick next, yeah.
Well, it's just on the convergence dividend, it just raises an interesting question, I think, that if Scotland had got this money, on the argument that it's because we bring the UK average down, would that same argument have been used within Scotland, saying that, well, it's the rough grazing that actually brings the Scottish average down, therefore the money belongs to the rough grazing? Who knows? And fair point. It would have been an interesting argument to have had. And on the Pillar 1 to Pillar 2, it was interesting when we answered the question that the Cabinet Secretary put out, you know, do you agree with 9.5? And our inherent reaction was, no, we don't. It should be higher than that because there's a lot more interesting and advantageous and targeted things going on in Pillar 2, which, as I said earlier, hopefully we're moving more towards. But where we get caught up is that, of course, ELFAS is something like 35% of Pillar 2 budget, and we think it's being used wrongly. So to argue that we wanted more money going into Pillar 2 so that it can go to the units on the better land sort of left us in a bit of confusion. But the principle is that if Elfas was sorted out, then more money should be going into Pillar 2.
Graham Day.
Yeah, I just want to make a point, if I may, and this is not a party political point in any way, but I just wonder what comfort the UK government's promised to review the budget allocations for the next CAP, as I understand it is for the next CAP, this review in 2016, when, in practical terms, the current government's opposed to direct payments in principle and wants to gradually remove that particular type of support anyway. There's a UK general election that year, and the current government could be replaced by another. Scotland could be an independent country by then, and if we're not independent and the Conservatives are re-elected, we could have an in-out referendum on EU membership anyway. So I just wonder what comfort is actually offered by what we're talking about.
Very little by the sounds of it. Would you agree?
There's a huge range of permutations in all that, and not one of us can say with any certainty as to what the outcome would be. We are where we are. We got a historic allocation of that convergence dividend. We argue that it should be on much more objective criteria based on the areas of the different land types. We have to go through that review process once we can compare like with like. Then we will have a very clear idea of what Scotland is owed on that basis, and then we would then press. We've certainly already asked the Commission as to whether we can change that to actually occur within this programme period, or does it have to wait till 2020? So as far as we're concerned, we'll continue to keep that pressure on. And all those other points, I wouldn't possibly dare to predict the outcome of any of them.
Right, that's a very good point, very nearly to end on. I thought we were going to get to a closure, but
I feel I have to say that if that's Mr Gray making non-political points, I'd hate to see him making political points. but I think I...
Of outcomes.
Fine. What I would like to put on record, I think, is that I think there is a very strong case to be made for some of the recommendations of the review to be implemented within this review period. And I find it very hard to believe that if a member state made an approach to the European Union to make some changes within its own budget, that the European Union would not look at that with some sympathy. That is not the view that Richard Lockhead has taken to date, but I hope he can be persuaded that we need to make representations on that behalf, because if reallocation is agreed through the review, then there is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't make the case for it to be put in place straight away, in my opinion. And I would like to think that we could, as we did on the convergence uplift issue, that we could all unite to make that case when and if those recommendations are made.
Well, indeed, all these ifs and buts, but I think it's a very fair point. We've had a good run round on many of these issues. We've got a lot of evidence to take ahead of the next few weeks so that we can advise from this committee to the government in Scotland what it should be doing with regard to the implementation of the CAP. And your thoughts on these things have given us excellent ammunition. I'd like to thank our witnesses for all of your contributions, some of them more trenchant than others, but some of them most certainly very helpful. Having thanked you, I'll just point out that our next meeting is on the 5th of March, and we'll be taking further evidence from stakeholders on the CAP and SRDP. And thank you for your attendance, and close this meeting.